We know Matty Beniers has a contract, and that's good news for the Seattle Kraken, at least for their roster. But what does it mean for other NHL young stars looking to cash in? Also, what does it mean for the overall legacy of our front office? We'll talk about that and so much more on today's episode of Locked On Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans, Seattle sports fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team every single day. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Erica L. Ayala, been your host here from the very beginning, taking you to the expansion draft, when Dave Hakstol was hired, when Dave Hakstol was fired, and of course, taking you through our farm system with the Kansas City Mavericks. We touch base with Tato, had their GM and head coach a bunch, as well as Disco Dan Bilesma, who of course, and Jessica Campbell, who are part of our new coaching staff. We've had all of those and more on the show. And we're looking forward to some pretty fun things coming up this season. We have some planning meetings coming up and hope to be able to share some of that soon. But stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss it because the coverage is going to get even better. Mentioned a few things at the top of the show, including if you missed last week's episode on the Beniers contract, check that out. There was a little bit of a delay getting that up on audio only, so apologies there, but it's on YouTube. You can find it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. But I want to let you know before we get too deep into it, today's episode of Locked On Kraken, as I mentioned, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5. That's right, $5 and get a three-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. So visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. And how we're going to get started is going over this Matty Beniers contract again. Now, I talked to you again last week about the Beniers contract. There are things that we love about the contract. Let's start there. We love that we get to keep Matty Beniers. You know, he's a Rookie of the Year winner. He has a lot of upside. He's fun to watch once he gets in motion. And do think that he can be a part of the leadership core for the Seattle Kraken as he continues to learn under Jaden Schwartz and Jordan Eberle in particular. Now, the things that maybe we scratch our head about is some people don't like the term. Well, it's a 7-year deal. Other people looking at the price, 7.14 AAV. Now that puts him on target with Brandon Montour. And there are a few differences between Matty Beniers and Brandon Montour. I mean, there's a few, but one glaring one is that Brandon Montour is a Stanley Cup champion and Matty Beniers is not. Now, again, I think it's difficult this time of year to put any, how do I want to say it? You can exaggerate things and also overlook and bury things when it comes to player comps around this time of year. And so I'm not saying that one player is quote unquote better than the other, but this is a results driven business. And we do know, that Brandon Montour has been part of a Stanley Cup championship team. That's precisely why the Seattle Kraken went after him in the offseason. In fairness, Matty Beniers has not been. Now, he's been on the cusp at the NCAA. He has been an Olympian, which I personally hold in high regard. I know not all people in the hockey world, specifically on the men's side, hold that in high regard, but I think playing internationally is a huge deal. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, he already has an individual championship, or excuse me, an individual award in the NHL. But how does that translate to helping his team win a championship? He's also coming off of a year where he did get an individual award, Rookie of the Year, and then we saw those numbers drop. We've also talked about everything, most everything for the Seattle Kraken. The numbers dropped. So is that a Matty Beniers issue? Is that a Seattle Kraken issue? Was it a coaching issue? Well, the Seattle Kraken seem to think perhaps in part it was coaching, and that's why Dan Bylsma and Jessica Campbell are a part of the new staff. So what I'm basically saying is I don't think we'll know just yet if this is a bad contract, but it has been good for young players throughout the league. And there are two players that I want to talk about, including one player that is on the Minnesota Wild. We'll talk about Marco Rossi first, because one of our behind the scenes helpers, Seth Topol, who is the host of Locked On Minnesota Wild, just had a conversation about what the Beniers contract could mean for Marco Rossi. And in Seth's analysis, he talks about an article that showed up on The Athletic, and they basically looked at, of course, retroactively, the 2023-24 season and looked at how players like Rossi, like Beniers, performed in that, and then estimated what their value was in that time frame. And actually, Rossi had a better AAV worth than Matty Beniers. I don't think it was quite $1 million, but last season, Rossi had a better AAV. Now, again, when you're using comps, especially in the offseason, you have to think the Minnesota Wild and the Seattle Kraken are not the same organization. They don't necessarily, outside of the obvious, win a Stanley Cup, have the same principles and values and kind of, foundational elements to their organization. They also don't have the same roster, which should be obvious, but the Seattle Kraken really, the new kid on the block, they have a lot of different things that are happening with their roster and how they've created their roster, which we're going to talk a little bit about in the next segment, because there's another article that put 4 GMs in the hot seat. And I think you can probably assume safely that if we're talking about it on Locked On Kraken, then Seattle Kraken GM, general manager, Ron Francis, makes that list. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And I do think the Beniers contract is related. But what I'm basically saying here is we don't know if and how Beniers, if he was getting an extension for the Minnesota Wild, or we're going to talk about the Dallas Stars and Wyatt Johnson in a minute. We have no idea of knowing if Matty B could make that same amount of money with any other team than the Seattle Kraken, who drafted him. And, there's a part of their legacy that they want to keep, right? As far as making that right decision. So that 7.14 AAV, again, that is in line with Stanley Cup champion defenseman Brandon Montour. We are also paying him 7.1 AAV. Now the difference, again, Beniers is a forward. Brandon Montour is a defenseman. Matty Beniers is 21 years old. Brandon Montour is 30 years old. So, and I'm kind of getting into some of the points that I want to make in the next segment. So let's just keep it with Matty B and Marco Rossi. Now, what this potentially could mean for Rossi, or even Wyatt Johnson, who we'll talk about in a little bit, is now there's a precedent, right, for young stars who are on the rise and could be franchise level players. And I thought it was interesting what Seth was talking about, because he talked about Beniers probably being overpaid. And again, talked about that analysis from The Athletic, talked about Chandler Stevenson likely being overpaid. But how much are we worried about that if it's just front loading a contract that then you can maneuver a little bit later? That's probably the case with Stevenson, but is that going to be the case with Matty Beniers? Well, I think a lot of us who watch the Kraken, fans of the Kraken, and likely the Kraken organization, they don't want that to be the case for Matty B. But can this be a way to drive up the price for Marco Rossi when he is about to make his contract negotiations? And I think Seth and others who follow the Minnesota Wild think it absolutely could. Now, another candidate where this Matty Beniers contract maybe drives up the price for them is Wyatt Johnson. Now, Johnson and Beniers, they actually were in that competition for Rookie of the Year. And this is the quote that we get. This is a fan-sided article. Dallas will probably use Beniers' extension as a starting point in extension talks with Johnson. Both are identical players. While Johnson deserves a tad more because of his hockey IQ, their words, not mine, and how he turns the game's tide, I don't believe Johnson will get less than Beniers. That would insult Johnston, excuse me, and what he's accomplished in a short time here in Dallas. I could see an 8-year extension in the neighborhood of $7.5 to $8 million. That would be a reasonable extension for Johnston. Now, this also means, though, what is this going to look like? And to bring it back to the Seattle Kraken, if and when Shane Wright, Berkeley Catton, maybe even a Riker Evans, we're talking forwards here, but what are these contracts going to look like for them in the future? And we have to make some assumptions here. We're assuming these are picks that we're going to keep, or, drafted players and prospects that we're going to keep, prospects that are going to make the Kraken with Shane Wright, Riker Evans. That's a very real scenario for this season. So now the Seattle Kraken has set a precedent, not just for the league, but for their own organization. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the Vince Dunn extension and compared that to maybe what Matty Beniers might get. Just as to remind you, Vince Dunn coming in at 7.35. And I do think that his results comparative to Matty Beniers, both insular with just the Seattle Kraken, but then, of course, again, Vince Dunn, Stanley Cup champion, Matty Beniers, not yet a Stanley Cup champion, but we want him to be one with the Seattle Kraken. And so I think that this could, depending on how the Seattle Kraken do, this could be something where are we kind of handcuffing ourselves from a monetary perspective with the salary cap in a way that's fruitful, meaning that we're getting what we need in the immediate, intermediate, and long term. And if you are an everydayer, if you were an OGer, especially if you're a Locked On insider, because we're doing our stock up, stock down, and I will have another one for you this week. You'll get first dibs on stock up, stock down. Are the Seattle Kraken going to be in a position where even if we are able to get back to the postseason, that we can sustain that? And I think there are some major question marks when it comes to the Kraken and how they have configured some of their contracts. And we're going to talk about that coming up next on today's episode. So now through September 22nd, and I do mean all, FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV-based plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season game on Sunday afternoon Then with your YouTube TV-based plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Now, not only do they have this super deal, but remember, you have to bet $5. So a few things that you might want to consider betting on, and we talk about this all the time. I love taking a look at the future odds, and the Seattle Kraken, when it comes to future odds in the division right now, sit behind LA Vancouver, Vegas, and Edmonton. So in that 5 spot in the Pacific Division, the odds to take the division plus 1,600. Is that something that you like? What about the chance of making the playoffs? Right now, the Seattle Kraken odds to make the playoffs, yes, at plus 150, no at minus 194. These are just some of the bets. I look at the WNBA bets as well. The Seattle Storm, an interesting team. We'll talk a little bit about a Kraken connection with the Seattle Storm later in the show. So we want to make sure that you are getting in on this deal for that NFL Sunday ticket. And of course, that you have a chance to take a look at the bets. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to download America's #1 sportsbook. Again, that's FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON. And as always, we hope that you are placing your bets responsibly. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. We told you about that FanDuel special, so maybe head over to, Locked On Fantasy Hockey, Locked On NHL Prospects, and of course, the Locked On NHL show to give you an idea of what's happening outside of the Seattle Kraken, which of course we'll talk about here. But if you want to not only place that $5 bet, get your NFL Sunday ticket, but also put yourself in a position maybe to make some of that money back, those are some of the shows I would recommend after, of course, you listen to us here at Locked On Kraken. Now, I kind of teased this a little bit because they're so intertwined. And again, everydayers and OGers, I've been talking about this quite honestly, not just for weeks, but what feels like for at least a season and a half. Some of what we're seeing with the Seattle Kraken, which we thought was being responsible and maybe a little cautious early on, is that something now that might bite us in the butt? I've been saying this for a while. It has to be go time for the Seattle Kraken. I don't think any contract should necessarily be safe or guaranteed, except for the ones, of course, that we just extended. So I'm thinking Eberle, Dunn, Beniers, obviously. We have Montour and Stevenson coming in and with a big chunk of change, as I talked about in the first segment and have talked about on the show before. But other than that, I mean, we've got some players that we might need to consider moving. When we look at UFAs that were coming up in the 25-26 season, these are some big ones, especially on the defensive side, which I think there could be some promise, but it also makes me a little bit nervous, and I'll talk about that. Adam Larson coming in at $4 million AAV on the nose. Riker Evans is an RFA in the 25-26 season. Then you have Will Borgen. Also, he's at 2.7 right now and is an unrestricted free agent after this season. That's just on the defensive side. A UFA next season, Brandon Tanev, if he makes it that far. Yanni Gourde at 5.16, Brandon Tanev at 3.5. So, we just extended Eeli Tolvanen, but only until the 26-27 season, and he's coming in at 3.45. What Eeli Tolvanen did compared to Matty Beniers, I think, again, the Matty Beniers contract is just as much as what he can do in the future and how much he will mean to the Seattle Kraken as he continues to develop, as it is what he's done since joining the Seattle Kraken. But I wouldn't be surprised if even in-house, some of these guys are looking at some of these contracts and they're like, so what does that mean for me? Like, how do I get some of that $7 million AAV? And that's just, again, in-house. And we talked about what that could mean for implications for younger stars, especially throughout the NHL. And that's why I wanted to bring up this article by NovaCapsFan.com, a worldwide community for Washington Capitals fans. And they have an article, Thin Ice, 4 NHL executives entering the 2024-25 season on the hot seat. Now, I will tell you, the picture is focused on the LA Kings, but you have Lou Lamoriello there. Also, their kind of New York Yankees vibe has been in conversation a lot. So that's going to be interesting. Lou Lamoriello on the list. Bill Guerin, we just talked about the Minnesota Wild, and they have some choices to make with at least one young player. Could be there. Rob Blake, as I mentioned, that's the headline photo of the article. And then, of course, they have the Seattle Kraken GM, Ron Francis. Now, here's what they say about Ronnie. It's really interesting. This is I'll read the direct quote and then break down some of it. Quote, "It may be time to start questioning Francis's job security after signing 30-year-old center Chandler Stevenson to a lucrative 7-year deal that carries a $6.25 million cap hit on July 1, which was ranked the second worst contract in the NHL by The Athletic." People really do not like this Stevenson contract, including in Kraken camp. I don't like it either. I'm hesitant to say it's the worst only because I'm interested to see if and how Chandler Stevenson can move the needle immediately for the Seattle Kraken. And I don't think we can delude ourselves into saying that that is not necessary. No more Wenberg. Yanu Gord putting in time at center. No Shane Wright last season. And Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, I think, gave a lot on the leadership, and we'll talk about him later in the show, actually. He gave a lot on the leadership side. He was so much fun to talk to. And as I have told the OGers and every A1 day oneers, I promised I would get a Kraken jersey with a player's name on it when we had our first melanated player, and it is Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. And there's also just a lot of connections to what the last month of my life has looked like. So we'll talk about that later in the show. But I mean, from a hockey perspective, I think the Kraken had to have known it was likely going to be a short-term deal or a short-term relationship. But then him getting injured didn't really help the cause. So is Chandler Stevenson a better center for center than Pierre-Edouard Bellemare? The hope is yes. That doesn't make the contract and the terms the right fit. And I think that's what the hang up really is when it comes to Chandler Stevenson. Anyway, the article continues, and apologies, especially to those listening on audio. I have a throat lozenge because my throat is very raw. We'll talk a little bit more about that, why, in the third segment. But Stevenson's contract comes after numerous high-profile free agent additions have not worked out for the Kraken. And who is mentioned, of course, first, Philip Grubauer, 6 years, $5.9 million. Chris Drieger, 3 years, $3.5 million. He spent all of last season in the AHL. Alexiak, 5 years, 4.6. Burakovsky. I know some of you are probably fatigued about me talking about Andrei Burakovsky. Others of you are probably entertained because there's never a moment that I mention Andrei Burakovsky where I say we can't put all of our eggs in the Berkey basket. I'm going to trademark that or something. And then also, now this is interesting. The article mentions Brian Dumoulin, 2 years, $3.5 million hit last year in 2023. And these are listed as contracts that have all backfired. And again, we're going to do our stock up, stock down. I'm curious to hear what people think about some of the people on this list. But then the writer goes on to say, of course, Dumoulin, we're not even seeing out that contract because we signed him, or we traded him, excuse me, to the Anaheim Ducks. This is also interesting. Francis's expansion draft strategy of saving money has not worked out, as Seattle ranks 24th in the NHL with a 107, 112, 27 record, 490 points percentage, and has finished below 500 in 2 of their first 3 seasons. And then just to add a little salt to the wound, the article mentions players that the Kraken front office passed on, including not comprehensive, just some names that I wanted to bring up. Alex Killorn, Evan Rodriguez, Max Domi. I'm okay with that one. And JT Comfort. You know, Nikita Zadorov. I mean, it truly, the list goes on and on. And, you know, on another episode, we might break down some of these names, and especially if we have another tough season, what that looks like. Now, here's the thing. You don't always have a crystal ball, right? But I think it is about that time. It's been time to really question some of these moves outside of the vacuum of the here and now. So we are months, sometimes years past from when these decisions, when these contracts were made, when the trades were made, etc. I think it is fair to assess Ronnie Francis and the front office at this moment in time. I think the leash for the Kraken is getting shorter and shorter. At least I hope that the front office is willing and able to make moves that may be unpopular at the moment, but will make the team better. And that sacrifice, that willingness to pivot, is where my uncomfortability with the Seattle Kraken is right now. I think we're a little bit too cautious. We're a little too calculated. I mean, you want to be thoughtful and you want to be calculated, but you also have to be able to hit certain trends in the market. And I fear sometimes that the Kraken might miss the wave, right? We kind of hop on the downward part of the trend. And I don't want that for us. You have to be able to take risks and even kind of be a disruptor. And that doesn't seem to be how Ron Francis and the front office are playing this. So maybe it'll work out, but it might not. And are we as a fan base prepared for that? Are the players, how are they going to react to that? And how do you set up a new coaching staff if you're not willing to kind of put it all out there? Put a lot of pressure on the coaches to make do with maybe a roster that realistically isn't going to be a deep playoff run roster. But maybe I'm wrong, because season 2, I was kind of wrong, but I do think that the players put a lot on their backs. Coming up next on Locked On Kraken, I'm going to try something. We've done this before, but I want to reframe this. And this is just news that has come up that has Kraken connections, whether that's to Climate Pledge Arena, the ownership group, individual players, the community. We have some fun things coming up in the third and final segment. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning at championships, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Now remember, it's for eligible items only. Exclusions do apply, and that eBay Guaranteed Fit is only for U.S. customers. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. There goes my voice cracking again. Erica L. Ayala here. We're bringing you to the third and final segment. Want to remind you, once you finish up here on Locked On Kraken, go listen to Locked On NHL. We talked about the FanDuel special. Maybe you want to listen to Locked On NHL Prospects. Maybe you want to listen to Locked On St. Louis Blues to get a sense of, what money you're going to put down for the opening game of the season. That's right. The Seattle Kraken will be taking on the St. Louis Blues. Afternoon matinee, at least if you're on the left coast. Some call it the best coast. I think it's to be determined for me, as someone who grew up on the East Coast. But my point is, we have so many resources for you, whether you're putting together a fantasy league, whether you're taking FanDuel up on some of their amazing offers, or you're just a diehard Seattle Kraken fan, and you know that at least part of knowing everything you can to know about the Seattle Kraken is by knowing some things about the teams and the players that they will be taking on the ice. Now, speaking of on the ice, there are some great on the ice and some off the ice connections to the Seattle Kraken that I want to make. And I love highlighting other content creators, especially those covering the Seattle Kraken or one big media family. It's all love, all of the guys and Allison, because, not Lucan, by the way, but, we're the lone women, at least that I know, who are regularly covering the Seattle Kraken. So if you're out there, hey, come say hi. Anyway, speaking of other content creators that we love and appreciate, I want to take you over to Daisy Jones and the Six. That's a great book. I think I like the book better than the series, but the series, actually, the music and how they compose the music, the lyrics are much better than the book. You didn't ask, but you're welcome. Davy Jones' Locker Room. An interview with Stephen Hiff. Now, you might not know who Stephen Hiff is. Unless you are a diehard Kraken fan, then you know that Stephen Hiff is a referee who made his NHL debut at Climate Pledge Arena. That's right. The Seattle Kraken took on the San Jose Sharks, and Hiff got the call up, and he joined Davy Jones' Locker Room to discuss what that was like in a recent video that they posted not too long ago. And I love these interviews that we're getting from, I almost said Daisy Jones again, from Davy Jones' Locker Room. Unfortunately, just to put that out there for you, the Kraken did lose this game, but thankfully they don't talk about the loss. They're more talking about the experience of Hiff and his 20+ family members and friends that not only came to the game, but had their officials uniform. That's right, zebra stripes. They were wearing them. Bowie did a crowd dive into the row of Hiff fans and supporters. And it was just a really fun interview. So stick tabs to Davy Jones' Locker Room. Here's a quote from Hiff himself, specifically talking about the fact that a lot of what we witnessed as those watching the game, or what we read about, or what you'll hear in this interview, he found out after the fact, because he was focused on the game, as he should be. But Stephen did take a moment to reflect on the importance of some of those moments that his family and friends had. Quote, "They're the ones that have gotten me to this stage in my career and supported me along the way. So for them to have those little memories or little tidbit videos to carry with them that's kind of what it's all about." I really thought that was good insight. Congratulations, Stephen. May you have many more. And hopefully, for our sake, if you call them more Kraken games, they'll win. Anyway, love that interview. Check out our show notes for the link to that video. I also want to take you to an article from the Hockey News, and the headline reads, former Kraken Nate Bastian and Brandon Montour, who of course is currently on the Kraken roster, inaugurate on Ontario Community Hockey Rink. Now, this is the hockey rink opening for the Muskoka Hockey League, which is one of the, Native and Indigenous communities. The league's under 20 youth groups had the honor of being the first to hit the ice for the inaugural skate. The event included which was free to the public, included a scrimmage between invited guests of the NHL. That's why Montour, Bastian, and many others were there. But already I'm getting the sense, haven't spoken directly to Brendan Montour, but he is very into his community back home in the Ontario area. And especially the Native community, the Indigenous community. And so, again, that's one of the things that has always attracted me to the Seattle Kraken and how they do things in the community, how they story tell around some of the things about their broadcasters, about their training staff. They do a good job of telling those stories. And I get the sense with Jeff Baker now on the storytelling side for the Seattle Kraken. I don't think we've really gotten into that too much. We might have to once we get closer to training camp, but I think we're going to get more of that. So this happens to come from the Hockey News. So taps to the Hockey News for putting this on my radar. And then finally, the connection to Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, and also why my voice is a little raw. That's because Team Algeria impressed during the 2024 Amerigol LATAM Cup. I remixed an article that was written by Bill Douglas for NHL.com. He used to run a blog called The Color of Hockey and now does that for the NHL because, hey, when we talk about melanated people, we shouldn't just do it for our community. We should be able to make actual money off of it. So shout out to you, Bill. I was with Bill in Florida the past few days. I actually did our last, or the segment that we had, the show that we had talking about Matty Beniers. I was in Florida at the moment. And I was there because the Amerigol LATAM Cup happens annually. And the Florida Panthers, the NHL, and the NHLPA are the main sponsors of that. It actually happens at the Ice Den, which is now the former practice facility of the Panthers. They have a new one, I think, called the Iceplex. And some of the games for the LATAM Cup were actually at the Iceplex. Anyway, I specifically want to talk about Team Algeria. For those who don't know, Algeria is a North African country, and the Amerigol LATAM Cup is all about, quote unquote, giving, quote unquote, non-traditional hockey markets opportunities and hockey teams from non-traditional hockey markets the opportunity to compete. And some of these teams are specifically using the Amerigol LATAM Cup to be accredited in the International Ice Hockey Federation, also known as the IIHF. And Algeria is one of those teams. Now, the MVP of the men's Division II championship game, which Algeria won in, like, they crushed it. Algeria, they play the way I wish the Seattle Kraken could play. They skate fast. They forecheck. And yes, they have fun. They have all of the 3 Fs. And the fourth, that I like to throw in there is that they play so free. They play with joy, but they are a tenacious group. That's what I want to see from the Seattle Kraken. And I think that's what Dan Bosma wants to see. We've talked about that. We will definitely talk about it again. But why am I telling you about Team Algeria? Why am I telling you about the Amerigol LATAM Cup? And what does this have to do with Pierre-Edouard Bellemare? Well, some of you likely know that Pierre-Edouard Bellemare is from France. I was just in France, in Paris, for the Paris Olympics, and I had told you in an episode that there were some connections to France through the training staff, actually, of the Seattle Kraken, who have trained some of the athletes competing in the Olympics. But now I have another connection, and that is because the MVP of the men's Division II Amerigol LATAM Cup is Ilies Jamel. He's an Algerian forward who lives in France, has competed at the youth level for France, and has trained with Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. Played 40 games for us for the Kraken last season, and a mainstay on the French national team. And we talked about that a little bit in the offseason because Pierre-Edouard Bellemare was one of the several members of the Seattle Kraken that competed at World Championships. Here's what Jamel had to say about Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. He represents French pride and represents it well, and he's someone we're very proud of. He's a strong, skilled, talented player, and it's very cool to come under his wing. And when I tell you, Jamel, wow, he had a hat trick in the game, including the game-winning goal to get Algeria their first ever championship. They defeated Egypt 8-3. So it was an all North African final in the men's division 2. Men's division 1, actually, my family on my mother's side comes from Cuba, or as I like to say, Cuba, and they won that game. I got to call both of these games as a part of the Amerigol LATAM Cup. That's why my voice is a little hoarse. But those are some of your Kraken connections. And this is something that I want to do, not just to highlight some of the creators that are covering the Seattle Kraken and doing a fantastic job unearthing or going deep into the depths to get some cool articles, but it also just is a way to show and to really appreciate that hockey is more than just the NHL. It's more than just NHL players, as is the case with Stephen Hiff. And I love to see that the Seattle Kraken, whether it's through their players, specifically through the organization, or just by way of their facilities at Climate Pledge Arena, they're making an impact. That is our show. I spent a lot of time in that second segment, as you probably can tell, because I'm pretty fired up. I really think we have to watch what's happening in the front office, and not just because, like, I don't care about ranking Ron Francis compared to other GMs, in as much as, like, you know, those lists are important and they're great for off-season content, but I'm focused on what the Seattle Kraken are actually doing. What is the plan, and what will that look like in season 4? But if you also are curious about that, then stay tuned. If I dare say, stay locked on this podcast, Locked on Kraken. We have you covered. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others. And as always, I'll say loud and proud. And as always, I'll close out the show saying, hold fast, stay true, and we say loud and proud, let's go Kraken. I'll catch you on the next episode, everybody. Until then, peace out. Be well.